Good evening. I want to extend a warm welcome to you all to this enlightening panel on human rights, foreign aid, and assistance. Today, we will gather to explore a significant topic that transcends borders and touches the very essence of our global community. Our focus lies on the vital role played by the U.S. State Department in advocating for the protection of human rights and social justice in Latin America and in East Asian countries. Notably, we will delve into the promotion of democratic governance and civil society engagement within the regions. By examining specific examples of U.S. foreign aid programs, we aim to understand the positive impact that such initiatives have made in Latin America and East Asia. Throughout history, the United States has recognized the importance of fostering collaboration and understanding between the nations. Foreign aid has emerged as a powerful diplomatic tool, offering an avenue to strengthen relationships while addressing pertinent issues. By extending assistance to countries in need, the United States has demonstrated its commitment to supporting the aspirations of individuals, communities, particularly in Latin America and East Asia. As we engage in fruitful discussions today, let us explore the multifaceted nature of foreign aid as a diplomatic tool. Together, let us examine how these initiatives have brought about meaningful transformations and how they continue to shape the landscape of human rights, social justice, and democratic governance. By expanding our understanding, we equip ourselves with the tools necessary to continue to a more equitable and compassionate world. Starting off today's panel, I will be introducing our panelists, and they will give you a background of their professional and personal development into the human rights and foreign assistance aid world and how they became part of the U.S. Department of State. Myself, I am Sierra Bracero. I am the current treasurer of the Hispanic and Latin Employee Council of Foreign Affairs agencies that helped bring together with the global program, GPA, here at the State Department, this student symposium today. I, in my day job, work as an anti-corruption visa advisor in the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs. But my trip into the State Department was not very usual, as a lot of people join through pathways or they have always been interested in the State Department. I came a little bit different. To back off, I was born in New York City to a Puerto Rican mother, and being Latina has been very much a part of who I am. So I've always had an interest in Latin America and helping foreign relations, strengthening our ties with Latin America. But right out of high school, instead of going to college, I joined the Marine Corps, where I served 8.5 years as a low altitude air defense gunner. And that was really what shaped my interest in working overseas and not just working in foreign affairs. I love that I got to travel and move every 3 or so years and make new friends and have these new experiences. Mind you, I was 18 years old and traveling and picking up my stuff was moving a suitcase, and now it's just a whole house. Trying to bring my kid somewhere today is not very fun. So that same sentiment is not as astounding as it once was. But after I got out of the Marines, I did not have any formal education. I just had my years in the military and my military experience. So I decided to go to my local community college, where I didn't really have a pathway of what I wanted to study and how I could be of continuous service to my country. So I just did a general background, a general studies degree. And I put my resume out for jobs because I no longer had a steady income. And I was fortunate enough to get contacted by a contractor with the State Department who saw my background and thought I would, because of my security clearance and some past duties, that I would work well in the human resources sector. So I came on as a contractor in the human resources, and I got really involved with employee organizations, to include HECPA being one of them. And this is how I kind of fell back in love with the international affairs world, meeting some colleagues and hearing their stories and what their jobs were. And so I decided to switch my major into international relations, and I wound up getting a full scholarship to Norwich University. So I left the State Department and I went on to continue my education. I recently came back last year as now I work in INL as an anti-corruption visa advisor, working on sanctions and visa restrictions in Latin America. And I owe it early all to that one opportunity that I got as a contractor for introducing me to the State Department and showing me the wide range of work available in this organization. And now I am part of the civil service, and I love my job very much. And now I think that the opportunities given here are so advanced. They have more than just contracting to come in. They have student pathways and internships. There are fellowships for programs that you can join when you're in school. And I just lucked into a contractor position that turned to change my world. And now I go to Harvard searching for a degree in government because I just fell in love so much that I wanted to further my education in this. And after this, we will now move over to Ivan so he can tell you about his entrance and his background with the department.
Thank you. So my name's Ivan Carpio. It's good to be here with you today. And I'm the coordinator for the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative, and I'm the lead for security issues in the State Department's Office of Caribbean Affairs in the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs. I started out as an intern in the International Organizations Bureau back in 2012, and I spent about 7 years in the International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs Bureau, at different times working on Haiti, the Eastern Caribbean, Guyana, and Honduras. I went to American University for law school and for a master's in international affairs. And I went to University of California, Santa Cruz for undergrad. I am a banana slug. That is a unique mascot we have for that one. So I grew up in San Ramon, California, and my family's Peruvian. We immigrated to the United States when I was 3 years old from Peru. My father had been a police officer in Peru at the time that Peru was experiencing some pretty severe unrest. There's a whole story there, but that's maybe more for another day. And part of the reason I'm here, I was president of HECFA from 2017 to 2019, and they really helped me. It really helped me understand kind of how to move into this career, and I got a lot of great advice. I made a lot of fantastic connections through that earlier in my career. And I'm very much still involved and glad to be here with you. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Ivan, for those inspiring words. Next, we're going to move on to our panelist, Francisco.
Thank you so much, Sierra, and thank you to HECFA for organizing the symposium and today's panel. So I'm a little bit in transition, but I'm also, I think, one of the maybe a unique pathway to some of my colleagues. So I'm a political appointee. So I started the State Department week one of the Biden-Harris administration. And a political appointment is a special sort of Schedule C pathway to different agencies or to join the administration. I started off my career in foreign policy working in the Senate, particularly on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where I was answering phone calls and answering mail for the first Hispanic chairman on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and then quickly rose through the ranks where I started working on Asia policy on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And then after 5 years of working on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I got a chance to work with the State Department a lot, including with HECFA, working on legislation to increase diversity for the State Department, but increasingly got more and more involved in Asia policy. After 5 years and after getting my graduate degree, I switched over to nonprofit and eventually foundation work, where I was really focused on working with human rights advocates, activists, and human rights defenders, and making sure that they have access to the various corridors of power here in Washington. So a lot of my work was working with on various human rights issues in the Asia Pacific and making sure that policymakers, whether they be at the State Department, the White House, or halls of Congress, have access to human rights defenders. And so eventually, when the Biden-Harris administration got elected, I let enough people know that I was interested in joining the administration. I was particularly interested in their desire to not only change and sort of increase our engagement with the region, but also changing the representation and inclusive nature in which we do that. And so I let enough people know, and they called me to join the administration by week 1. And I was super privileged and talented, privileged and excited to have this opportunity as a first-generation immigrant, as a queer, Hispanic, the opportunity to be able to serve my country, but also to be able to do so in a historic administration and continue the work I was doing both on Asia policy, but particularly human rights policy, was extremely excited. So during my 2.5 years here at the State Department, I've worked in the front office of the East Asia and the Pacific Bureau, mainly as a strategic planner and speechwriter for the Assistant Secretary, but as well as leading many of his human rights initiative and projects and embedding human rights in all of our diplomacy throughout the region. In the last couple of months, I was able to work and sort of elevated to be the Deputy Special Envoy for compact negotiations, which we can talk about later. But just this week, we signed a new agreement, a historic agreement for 20 years with the Marshall Islands. And so part of the reason this is bittersweet, but I'm excited that this is my last panel at the State Department, is because I'll be wrapping up my time at the State Department and heading over to USAID. So I think my bio actually says my new USAID title, where I'll be transitioning tomorrow and starting off as USAID as the China policy lead, where I'll be carrying some of the work that I did here at the State Department, working on People's Republic of China issues, but looking at those issues kind of globally. So really looking forward to the conversation. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Francisco, and we wish you well in your future endeavors, even though you will be sorely missed here at the State Department. And for our next panelist, we have Brian.
Thank you, Sarah. It's great to be here today with everybody. I appreciate the opportunity to join this panel and talk about this important issue. So my name is Brian Cameron. I'm a Foreign Affairs Officer in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor within the State Department. I work within the Office of Global Programmings within DRL. In that office, we manage foreign assistance grants that support civil society organizations around the world who are working to advance democracy, labor rights, and human rights. And my particular area of focus is within Latin America and the Caribbean. I've worked on a number of interesting countries, including many close contacts in the regions. So grown to really learn and appreciate the work that human rights defenders are doing and the important role of foreign aid in supporting their work. Our office, my path to DRL started years ago. I was initially a Peace Corps volunteer in Honduras. Backing up even further, I grew up in San Diego, southern San Diego, in fact, very close to the border of Tijuana, and spent much of my youth in northern Mexico with family and in San Diego. And that experience led me into the Peace Corps, where I served as a volunteer in Honduras for 2.5 years. During the Peace Corps, I lived in a small mountain village, 1,200 coffee farmers. I learned a lot from that experience. And that led me into education. I got a degree in teaching, which I used to go back into Latin America. And through Fulbright Fellowship, I was in Brazil teaching English and computer skills to youth there. And then later was able to parlay that into another stint in Colombia, working with English teachers in Northern Colombia. I spent the better part of my 20s in and out of Latin America before getting a master's degree at the University of California, San Diego. And it was from there that I joined the National Democratic Institute, which is an international nonprofit organization that does work on democratic governance issues. Again, there I focused on Latin America. And it was from that job I was able to parlay and join the department where I've been for 7 years now, managing foreign assistance grants. So I look forward to the conversation today. Thank you very much again for the opportunity to join. Back to you, Sarah.
Thank you very much for that, Brian. And for our final panelist, we have Eduardo.
Thank you, Sierra, and good afternoon, everybody. It's quite a pleasure to be here. Thanks to everybody taking part in this very timely discussion. My name is Carlos Eduardo Vargas Toro. I am the policy advisor on human rights for the Andes, which is Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia. In the same bureau where my good colleague Brian is from, which is the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. In this specific bureau, we promote democracy, we formulate human rights policy, and we make sure human rights and labor policy, we make sure that it's implemented into overall US government foreign policy. Like Sierra, I went to a community college. I went to Orange Coast College in California, so I have that connection with Brian and with Ivan as well, because I lived in California. I studied public health, and then I did a postgraduate in healthcare administration and business administration and epidemiology at California State University, Long Beach. So I worked in public health for many years, and I decided that I wanted to have a career change. I really liked international health, and I've always lived between Colombia and the United States, working in Colombia. So I grew up in Colombia, but we travel frequently to the United States. So I decided to pursue a graduate degree in diplomacy and international relations at Seton Hall University in New Jersey. Once there, I did an internship with the United Nations. After I graduated, I worked with various non-governmental organizations, promoting human rights and working on refugee issues. One of note was Caritas Internationalis, which is the action arm of the Catholic Church. It's known the world over. I also joined the United Nations, so I was working over there. And then finally, I came to join the US government when I came in 2014 to Washington, DC, to be part of President Obama's administration. So I too, like Francisco, was a political appointee. I served in the President Obama's administration, reporting to the White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. I served as a senior communications officer at the USAID mission, essentially kind of part of the embassy in Guatemala City, Guatemala. And I was the director and acting director of the Center for Faith-Based and Community Initiatives there. In 2017, I left USAID and I joined the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy, a think tank. And then in 2020, I joined the US Department of State in a career position. And this is where I'm at right now. As I said, I'm a policy advisor on human rights. So we ensure that human rights compliance, human rights policy, and is at the forefront of our policy. We ensure that it's at the forefront of our communications with foreign governments, and that we are a source for people that are advocating, or a venue for people that need to share information on human rights abuses throughout my specific region. It's a pleasure to be here with everybody. Thanks for having me.
It is our pleasure to have you, Eduardo. Thank you very much. And thank you to all of our panelists who have joined us today. So let's jump right into it. Our first, the first question we have for our panelists is, could you speak to the positive impact of American aid programs at the State Department, and what kind of considerations went into the cultivation of these programs? What variables are paramount to keep in mind when focusing on the needs of foreign communities? And we will direct this question first to Ivan.
Thank you. And to sort of frame my answer, I just want to talk a little bit about the program I oversee, starting in, and to explain that also that I've had the benefit of working on the program side of things, as well as on now in my current role on the policy side of things. So the program that I work on, we started in 2010. It's called the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative. And through this program, we work with Caribbean partners to build their capacity to disrupt illicit trafficking and transnational crime, and to advance Caribbean and U.S. citizen security. So at the big picture regional level, we're working on maritime law enforcement, border and port security, firearms trafficking, transnational organized crime, gangs, law enforcement, justice sector capacity building, and youth crime and violence prevention. And in my role, I am fortunate to be having done some of the very more intensive project level things. I'm now in a position where I'm working with the U.S. Agency for International Development, the State Department Bureau of Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, State Department Bureau of Political and Military Affairs. And I'm in a position where I am convening, I'm organizing how we talk to partner countries at the security minister level and set out our shared priorities for what we're going to do in the coming year under this big initiative of, again, 13 partner countries, lots of United States folks working on this as well. So, so there's that communication piece. Are we identifying our goals? Are we on the same page on that? Is there the political will? Is there that buy-in? And that takes me to the stakeholders. Do we have the right stakeholders? Or we have, in this context of this conversation, it's the civil society. The civil society piece is really key. And part of this is also in our role. I've heard other people say this, and I very much buy into this. Our foreign assistance has to do with our investment is getting us a seat at the table. It's not strictly something that we're working on. It's a partnership, but we have a seat at the table, and we're supporting, we're helping to address these issues, and we're partnering on that. And so a lot of the time it's technical assistance, it's training, it's taking what are our partners asking for? How can we be responsive to that? And in that process, there's that other part I mentioned where it's also strengthening that bilateral relationship. And it's really both. So I'll say for my part, for my role, I'm privileged to see down to the detailed project level up to how are we setting out these priorities? How are we deciding with our partner countries what are the top things that we're going to be focused on for the next year? But I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Ivan. That is wonderful and great information, and thank you so much for sharing. Well, Francisco, would you mind going next? Thank you.
Yeah, happy to. And I think for this answer, maybe I'll start with the recent negotiations that I mentioned at the outset. So after World War II, 3 Pacific Island nations went from being under our sort of jurisdiction to becoming trust territories, to then ultimately deciding that they wanted to be freely associated states. And then we negotiated what's called the Compacts of Freely Associated States, which determine the framework for how their association, their independence, their self-determination, but also provided 20 years of economic assistance. So this is a third iteration where we renegotiated 20 years of economic assistance, and it was led by a special presidential envoy. I was fortunate enough to be his deputy, but among these negotiations, we had to make sure that we followed a couple of different guiding principles, both for the negotiations, but also for the assistance that the U.S. was providing. So first issue that I would raise is that the assistance needed to be strategic. And I'll say that in 2 ways, this assistance in particular was strategic. One is that the economic assistance brought us not only goodwill with the countries, but it also, as part of the compact, gave us the ability, strategic defense rights over the airspace, the defense land, and economic exclusive zone in the water, in the maritime zones, to be able to deny any competitors in basically the entire Northern Pacific. So we oftentimes don't talk about the Pacific Islands, but they're actually very much strategically important and increasingly more in the news because of peer competitors who are trying to push us out of the Indo-Pacific. So one, there's a strategic interest for the United States to continue to provide support for many of these countries. And then the individual economic assistance was provided in key sectors. One of them is climate change. So the Marshall Islands, which is one of the 3 Pacific Islands, is one of the lowest sort of island nations where you can see the water, sea level rise directly up and rising every year. So you can see the effects of climate change impacting the country every year. 2, issues of capacity are a big issue for island nations. They don't have the resources or both in terms of natural resources, but also people power to be able to provide for many of the needs or their economic needs of their country. And so building that economic sort of capacity building was really important. The second, and it sort of goes to Ivan's point about stakeholders, it was really important in the negotiations that we were listening to our partners and taking their interests in mind when determining the economic assistance. So part of the issue that became really important in these negotiations for all 3 was this issue of being able to provide climate change support, being able to provide public health assistance, especially in the aftermath of COVID. But also there is a slew of federal programs that the United States offers as part of the compacts. So things like veterans access, education access, all types of programs that are part of the compact agreements and that we needed to make sure we were listening to, but also responding to the requests of our partners. And third, and part of the reason I joined a little bit late is because congressional oversight is really important. But really, it's the overall due diligence for taxpayer dollars when we provide U.S. foreign assistance to making sure that that money is going to responsible stakeholders, responsible partners. And there's a fiduciary duty to making sure that we can provide that oversight that Congress requires of us. So that in the case of compacts takes many forms, whether there is a committee that oversees many of the programs, but then both in the output, whether it's GAO reporting, monitoring and evaluation, and other auditing measures that go into the programs. But all of these issues really, I think, make it fundamental for programs and assistance that we provide to be effective. Over.
What wonderful information, and thank you for the historical context, Francisco. Next up, we have Brian.
Thank you, sir. So to complement the work that Francisco and Ivan had touched on, DRL's Office of Global Programs has a civil society-centered foreign assistance approach, in that we do not issue foreign aid to foreign governments, but rather our foreign assistance, which is approximately $400 million annually, is directed to civil society organizations. So human rights organizations on the ground, investigative journalist networks. We do a variety of programming in various spaces. So a few examples of how this aid has been impactful. In the democracy and governance space, DRL supports civil society organizations that can conduct, for example, parallel vote tabulations to ensure that elections are held in free and fair manner within their countries. We also support civil society coalitions who work to increase youth and women's participation in political processes, as well as policymaking processes, to ensure that they're as inclusive as possible and help to strengthen these democratic institutions. We support investigative journalists who do outstanding work to investigate and expose corruption or human rights violations, and to make sure that that comes to the light of day so that civil society actors and the public at large can act upon that information. We support social movements who are advancing the rights of LGBTQ plus or individuals and organizations that are working to advance rights of other marginalized groups as well. We also have programs that focus on strengthening digital security and access to the internet, particularly in countries where governments are particularly adverse to civil society actors having unfettered access to information. And we also have teams within DRL's program office that work to bring justice to victims that forcibly disappeared, particularly in Latin America. We have many interesting programs that support forensic anthropologists who are working with victims and their families to bring justice or greater access to justice and to hold perpetrators of human rights violations accountable. In terms of variables to keep at the forefront of our planning, from the civil society perspective, I think one of the founding principles that we work off of is that the programs are designed in a bottom-up fashion. We work with grants, and we expect that the grants are developed in consultation and to follow the interests of civil society organizations. We are not directed from Washington, and we do not direct civil society organizations to do or pursue our own interests, but rather conversely supporting them and their own organic interests. We also make sure that programs work to include individuals from marginalized groups, many of whom face layers of discrimination within their communities, and require an intersectional program approach to ensure that they have equitable support from our programming. Lastly, DRL, much like our USAID colleagues, are focused on ensuring that maximum amount of resources are flowing to organizations based in the region. By that, it's a localization effort and helping to ensure that the foreign assistance funds designed for other countries are in fact not held here in Washington, but rather reaching organizations on the ground doing much of the hard work in the human rights space. So I'll leave it there and turn it back to you. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you very much on that, Brian. And finally, Eduardo, your take.
Thanks, Sarah. Appreciate that. You know, Ivan, Francisco, and Brian pointed out some very important things of how the positive impacts of U.S. aid programs abroad. And I think that anybody could just look online and see countless stories of what transpires and how that is. Let me just share a particular story of how our aid was very important. And one of the times that I remember feeling extremely proud of the work that we do in the United States government, in the Department of State, and the U.S. Agency for International Development. In 2009, I was in Lebanon, and this was essentially, pretty much at the height of the Iraqi refugee crisis. A lot of Iraqis had left Iraq. They were in Syria and Jordan. A lot of them had come into Lebanon, and Lebanon was a very small country that took in a great number of them. And we went into one of the apartments and spoke with one of 3 families living there. There was a total of about 18 people in two rooms. We essentially said, we heard their concerns, we heard their stories, and it's very, very difficult thing to see, the plight of the Iraqi refugees. But I remember at a specific moment, he said, it's because of America that we're able to be here in Lebanon. And I guess he had an intuition that we were feeling bad for him, because he said, because of you, my family's been able to eat. Because of you, my daughter has warmth at night. And we were, okay, exactly how is this? And he showed us this burlap sack from USAID, right? It has the American flag. It says from the American people. And it's food for people that are displaced, that are facing, whether it's displacement because of a conflict, of an earthquake, of a hurricane, of a natural disaster, whatever the case is. And they said this was a country that had sent us food. Because of this burlap sack, because of the sack, I was able to feed my family, which brought us here to Lebanon. Because of this sack, we were able to make blankets for my daughter. And now that might not seem like a lot to us, but to them, that was the difference between life and death. And that was the difference for a father to being able to provide for his family. And the fact that, just us sending that food assistance to them had such an impact, makes you think, what can we do on a larger scale? And I think Ivan, Francisco, and Brian have given you examples of what we could do on a larger scale. But I think this goes to show, like at the individual level, how our aid has a positive impact on many people. Now, I think Sierra asked also what variables we need to consider when we develop aid or when we're focusing on the needs of foreign communities. I think it's very important, and Brian alluded to this as well, that we look and we engage with the community, that we look at local solutions, right? The people that are living in this situation, they know the most of what they need to overcome whatever obstacle or overcome whatever hurdle their community, their families, their ethnicities are living at the moment. I think we have to have buy-in from these communities when we develop the programs. This is something that, looking forward to local solutions is something that since the Obama administration, we've been implementing in our foreign policy and in our and in our assistance. And then finally, I'll say, we also work with civil society, making sure that we engage with civil society. They're very important to engage with, but also faith-based organizations. And these are the organizations that provide charity based on their beliefs of providing service to others. And sometimes we've overlooked them in our program implementation for development, but I think that they're of utmost importance for us to consider. I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Sierra.
Thank you very much for the examples and the heartfelt stories that came with that, Eduardo. For our next question for our panelists, we will be exploring how our panelists grapple with the tensions between advancing the aims of human rights and democracy with the political over-involvement, as heard earlier about the congressional oversight. Given the historical connotations of imperialism, how would you say the state's approach to foreign policy has shifted, and where is there still room for improvement? And our first panelist to answer will be Francisco.
Yeah, this is a question that comes up a lot, both when I was in the International Human Rights Organization, when I was a philanthropist in a big foundation, and very much so as a diplomat. It's one that I often think about and reflect frequently on. I'll pull a couple threads. One is that this issue about local and civil society is really important. It's not the United States imposing human rights solutions to other countries. It's supporting local agents of change who are supporting human rights within their own countries. So I'll give a vivid example. When I traveled to Vietnam with the LGBT Special Envoy, we first met with civil society and realized that there was a vocal campaign within Vietnam to push for the banning of conversion therapy inside the country. So we elevated the reports and research, often very technical data aggregation from that NGO, and brought it to the Ministry of Health in Vietnam. The Ministry of Health in Vietnam, which oftentimes we don't see a lot of eye to eye with the Vietnamese government, was really surprised that these practices were actually happening within their own system and their own country. A couple months later, they banned and issued a decree banning conversion therapy within their own country. Why was that effective? Not because the US was able to speak to the Ministry of Health, but because there was an active campaign organized by local civil society leaders, LGBTQI leaders within their own country who had done the research and technical work to elevate this issue and be able to provide it, that data to their own government. We were simply the bridge between civil society and their own governments. So ultimately, sometimes I have governments say, well, this is not the way we do things in my country, or, United States always comes about human rights and it's really imperialism in disguise. Sometimes that sort of criticism is fair, but oftentimes I point to civil society within their own country and say, how is it the United States or imperialism if your own citizens are the ones that we got this information from? The second is that, and I learned this in the negotiations I mentioned earlier, when talking to governments, oftentimes just by the United States, by being a big country or a hegemon, is sort of seen with sort of doubts of imperialism. And again, for good reason, many of the history I won't even try to approach here. But I think respect and listening to our partners and engaging our partners in a way that takes their views into account, does not dismiss them at face value, goes a long way. Respect is cheap, but it really goes a really long way to building you that kind of trust that hopefully gets you the kind of change that you need to see within those systems. And third, maybe I'll just say that human rights are universal. The United States played a leading role in creating the universal of human rights, but ultimately all governments came to the table and agreed upon the universal principles. So it is not the US human rights system, it is a universal principles. Every citizen, not just US citizens, have a right for fundamental freedoms that are outlaid in the Universal Human Rights Declaration. And so I would use that as against imperialism. Maybe I'll just say one way in which the State Department's approach has changed during my time here is there's been a really renewed focus on equity and justice, particularly racial discrimination. One of my colleagues and good friend of mine, was appointed the first special representative to countering discrimination at the State Department. We actually both came from the same foundation over to the State Department together. And Desiree Cormier-Smith, Special Representative Cormier-Smith, is really looking at charges of human rights, but through a countering discrimination, countering racism lens, which I think is really an important elevation of this issue, especially in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, but also the sort of anti-racism and Black Lives Matter movement that we've seen all around the world. It's really important for the United States to really elevate these issues, and it's really been remarkable to see how the Envoy's office and the entire U.S. has been able to raise equity as a foreign policy issue. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your work on that, Francisco. That is something that hits very close to home and internationally on the world stage. So we do appreciate your work in this. Our next panelist, Brian, will give his remarks.
Thank you, Sarah. Francisco makes excellent points. And so I'll be brief on the first element in terms of over-involvement, and certainly a legacy that we are still living with today, in particular with Latin America and the U.S.'s involvement in the region historically. I think some of the things that help to guard against over-involvement in terms of DRL's approach to foreign assistance with civil society organizations that I'll highlight is one, we operate on grants and cooperative agreements versus contracts. Grants are different from contracts. We are not procuring services per se from civil society and directing their actions, but rather asking them to submit to us their own objectives and interests and figuring out how we as a department can best support their own, again, indigenous and organic interest sets. So I think that's an important distinction. There are others as well. For example, we do not fund political parties. We do work with organizations that work on strengthening the ability of political parties to function in their important role as a democratic institution, but those organizations work across the party spectrum. They are not ideological in their direction and in their work. And again, we do not provide funding for foreign parties to do any type of work domestically that we also wouldn't appreciate, I think, happening here on U.S. soil. We also, in terms of journalism, for example, do not exercise any editorial control or over content that journalists produce. Many a times investigations may in fact reveal things that are unsavory for the U.S. And in fact, our approach is always to defend their right and their freedom of expression to follow the investigation wherever it may lead, and regardless of what the investigation reveals. That's a strong principle that we stand behind with partners, and it plays out in practice. And I can think of a few investigations that have tied back to the U.S. And actually have catalyzed action from domestic law enforcement agencies to take action against some of the bad actors that have been revealed through these investigations. And then I would also note that we work with many civil society organizations in the region that are actually quite critical of U.S. foreign policy. And rather than shy away from that, we actually create spaces where policymakers and others within the U.S. government can hear directly from those individuals. And I think that's a really important element here, so that, one, they have a platform and an opportunity to convey their views directly to U.S. policymakers. And it also shows that we are open to being critical of ourselves. And I'm sure Eduardo can share a bit more on his experience with human rights dialogues, that we do not approach human rights from a do as we say, not as we do perspective, but rather we hold ourselves to the same standards. And where we fall short as a government, I think we genuinely engage with other governments with a willingness to examine our own shortcomings and to work towards improving those. So I think those are some important elements that help to guard against overreach and some of the legitimate concerns about our historical involvement in that in the past. In terms of, and just briefly, your last question, I think some of the things that I've noticed in my 7 years with the department that have improved is that listening capacity with civil society organizations and think tanks. I've seen a greater willingness within policy circles to open up and hear from experts on the outside. And I will note, though, some areas where we have room for improvement. One in particular, I think, is the department's ability to make evidence-based and data-driven decisions. Unfortunately, be it the pace of events unfolding in the world or just our internal processes, there are often not enough opportunities for us to research and to do the analytical work required with data to make evidence-based and informed decisions. So I'll leave that and turn it back to you, Sierra. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Brian. And next, we do have Eduardo to tie in that human affairs aspect in DRL.
Perfect. Thanks, Sierra. Yeah, I completely concur with everything Brian and Francisco have mentioned. You know, the question is, how do we deal with the tensions between advancing human rights and democracy with political over-involvement? And as both Francisco and Brian have mentioned, yeah, we do have a history in that. You know, maybe it's not, you know, the best history, but we do have a history. And I think that we have to acknowledge that in our interactions with different countries and understand that, you know, we're at a different point in time, both in history and in our foreign policy. So is the US presidents, when, you know, Franklin Delano Roosevelt once said, in any moment of decision, the best thing to do is the right thing. And I think for me, on a very selfish note, I have a pretty easy job within the Department of State because my work and my decisions of going to work is to be promoting human rights. And this is essential to everybody, right? It can't be, there's certain human rights for certain people and some for others and everything. No, this is what we're talking about in a sense of equality, and everybody is afforded the same basic principles in which we promote human rights. So for me, that aspect has always been appealing to this specific issue of just what we have in common is humanity. And you know, it's doing the right thing, right? And so maybe I'm at a loss for words, but I think that argument is so strong, it doesn't need to be explained, right? You know, just do the right thing in that aspect. So that's how I've been dealing with it within the State Department. I know, I think acknowledging and recognizing you know, U.S. foreign policy in the past is also important on how we interact with not only civil society, but other governments and other countries. Now, how is this approach shifting, or how are we getting to this, to a new approach on this aspect? And I believe definitely it's through diversity, right? And I'm not speaking just about racial diversity, but diversity of thought, diversity of geographic location, diversity of educational experiences, right? It may sound a bit cliche, but our biggest strength is the fact that, you know, the United States is so diverse, and we can draw upon different points of view from different people that are all Americans. And that's an area where we've been able to incorporate different aspects of foreign policy that have been beneficial both to the United States and to the countries that we've been interacting with. And we can't get that if we just have one homogenous society represented in the State Department. Thanks, Sierra.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. And now we have Ivan with WHA.
Thanks. I'll keep my points on this question short, but just a lot of fully support a lot of things that have already been said. I want to echo what Francisco said about respect, from my perspective, you know, listening to what our partners are saying, what they're asking for, and working in a challenging historical context, taking time to learn that political history, echoing what's it's incumbent on us to know that context, to invest that time to learn it, and also to be aware of the policy context. And working on a portfolio, I work with 13 Caribbean partners. Each of those countries has their own political discussions, their own rich debates, and being respectful of that as well. And to frame in sort of what I see as the most effective way forward, and something that I very much try to do in my role, is to try to put forth the effort to meet our partners on responding to what they're requesting, what they're setting as their priorities, where we can provide the technical resources and advice to help them achieve their goals, that they've got that investment. Those are some of the most successful kinds of engagements I've been able to work on. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Ivan. And thank you all who have joined us today virtually for coming and supporting our panelists and listening to their views. And thank you, panelists, for coming out today and sharing your views with our student audience. At this moment, I'd like to open up the floor to our panelists. If you have any last thoughts that you would like to share with the students regarding your positions, your entrance into the State Department, or any overall advice you would like to give. Francisco, you're first.
Thank you, Sierra. Maybe I'll just make a pitch for why it's so important for Latinos and Hispanics to join national security and foreign policy. A lot of us have an immigrant background. I really think that immigration and immigrants is really a foreign policy issue. The reason for why my family immigrated from Ecuador and Dominican Republic is ultimately a foreign policy issue. It's whether our development issues didn't fully actually work in those countries, or it's a result of those governments not able to fulfill their promises. And ultimately, I really think that the United States benefits from having us at the table. And I strongly believe that if our voices are not at the table, then those who don't want Hispanics or don't want immigrants speaking up get to define what is a national security issue. And oftentimes there's a saying that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And I really think that applies to the Latino community when it comes to foreign policy and national security. So to all the students out there, I really urge you, join the conversation, enlist in a foreign policy career. We really need you now more than ever.
I want to support the call to action there and say, there's different kinds of work that you can do in these spaces. My background is program and project management, and now in the policy space, but I work very closely with people who, and a skill set that I aspire to develop, monitoring and evaluation. There's just all of these tools in this space, the sort of knowledge management side, the training pieces. There's a rich universe of careers that I was not aware of before I started in this work. So I just want to, if you're interested in doing this kind of work, consider looking into different skills you can build, different ways you can get experience, and it's great this is a great career path for lifelong learners, and I've gotten a lot out of it in that sense too.
Maybe I'll take advantage. I think those are excellent points my colleagues raised, and I'll make one plug here to get out there. And as a former Peace Corps volunteer, that experience was transformative and foundational for me. And I highly encourage anybody interested in a career in foreign policy or foreign affairs to spend time in the region that you're interested in, even if it's not related on the specific issue set that you might be interested in now. That time and experience, I think, will serve you and continue to serve you throughout your career as you move forward. So a big plug for Peace Corps and for other similar federal programs that are making it easy for American citizens and others to get out into other communities. Thank you.
Perfect. And I'd just like to add as well, I appreciate everybody coming out to this panel and joining my colleagues and I as we speak on this. Also, to please consider the fact that, the Department of State as good of a workplace as it is not the only institution in the government that's working on foreign policy, right? The U.S. Agency for International Development works on foreign policy. The United States Department of Commerce, their Foreign Commercial Service, works in foreign policy. The United States Department of Agriculture, the Foreign Agricultural Service, works in foreign policy. The U.S. Agency for Global Media and the Peace Corps, they all are actually outside working in different countries on these issues. So just know that there's many more options, and many of the domestic agencies or the domestic departments here in Washington, D.C. also have offices that interact at the international level. But again, State Department, U.S. Agency for International Development, Department of Agriculture, Department of Commerce, and U.S. Agency for Global Media, and Peace Corps. Those are the 6 big ones where you're going to be traveling abroad and working. And good luck with everything.
Again, I want to thank all of our panelists for coming out and for sharing their vast wisdom and knowledge and experience throughout their years here at the U.S. Department of State. And I would like to thank you again for joining us from wherever you are. I hope this has motivated you in some way, shape, or form to either join the federal government or an NGO or just explore the options you have available to you. You are more than welcome to reach out to the GPA or any front-facing partners here at the U.S. Department of State, and even HECFA itself, if you have any questions about what foreign service or foreign aid, human rights, or foreign assistance really is, or any other topics or questions regarding international affairs. We are more than happy to speak with you and share our knowledge if we have it, or find someone who does that can answer questions that you may have. For those of you who would like to review the information that was given today or hear this again, we will have these recordings available in a few weeks. HECFA, the Hispanic and Latin Employee Council for Foreign Affairs Agency, will have this placed on their YouTube website. And you can also check out their homepage for further information. It's HECFA, HECFAA.org. And I just want to end again with just thanking you so much for coming out and supporting us. We know that if you're on Eastern time, it is very late. So I just, again, thank you for coming with us. And we hope to see you in person one day working at the State Department or in another capacity in foreign affairs.